Well, thank you. I always enjoy a chance to talk about railroads, um, and in particular, this Transcontinental Railroad topic is one that I've got increasingly interested in. Now, I am trying to share a screen. Did I actually share that correctly? Is that, are you seeing that?
Yep.
Okay, so that's the first. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, well, actually more than a couple of years ago, I was asked, the Janesville Library approached the East Troy Railroad Museum where I volunteer, and they wanted somebody to talk about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And that's kind of out of the bailiwick of the East Troy Railroad Museum, but I tend to get a lot of those speaker requests referred to me if I was willing. And I said, well, I didn't have a talk put together, but I certainly had, there was plenty of time. And so I delved into the subject. And as it turned out, the talk got delayed because the library was renewing their gathering space. And then we had COVID and on and on and on. So anyway, we finally had it, and it was seemed to be fairly well received. And so I've enjoyed talking about it and continuing to research the topic and get new material. Now, what was striking, we're just about 4 days from the 152nd anniversary, and which would be about this time of day, actually, that it happened. And 2 years ago, we were also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first landing on the moon. Early in my electrical engineering career, I was involved with that. I was not involved personally with the Transcontinental Railroad, even though my children and grandchildren insist that I'm old enough. Anyway, it's kind of interesting to think about. We went from bridging the continent with a railroad and to the surface of the moon in 100 years. And it's now been more than 50 years since we got to the surface of the moon. And that got me thinking about a lot of the timeline of these things and when they occurred. Declaration of Independence, of course, 1776. The government organized the way we know it now in 1789 with the Constitution. The Erie Canal was one of the first major transportation infrastructure projects that was opened in 1825. Actually, there was a Cumberland Road that was authorized in 1806 by Congress, but they were expecting states and other people to contribute to it. It got to Cumberland and Wheeling, and by 1820, they were extending it. They authorized it to St. Louis, but it actually stopped about 1839 in Vandalia, Illinois, because of the competition of railroads. Much better transportation option by then than roads. That's US 40 nowadays. When the Erie Canal opened in 1825, it cut transportation costs by 95%. So that really encouraged development of commerce between, well, it's tied the Great Lakes to the east and therefore Chicago, and that facilitated the growth of the Midwest. But these sorts of things started really way back. The C&O Canal was promoted by George Washington, and that got into operation, and but that again was eclipsed by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which started in 1827. So by 1848, we had the California Gold Rush. We had the tensions building between the North and the South. With the Gold Rush, California statehood in 1850. Actually, the first Transcontinental Railroad in the Western Hemisphere was 1855 with the Panama Railroad. Pony Express got at least the communication a little faster to California. It got to be instantaneous by 1861. And we got the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad was authorized in 1862, finished in 1869. The total cost in those dollars was about $111 million. If you correct for inflation in today's dollars, that would be about $1.25 billion. And just by way of comparison, the I-3990 expansion that they started in 2015 and scheduled to finish, I think, this year. That's a 7-year project like the Transcontinental Railroad was. And that's $1.75 billion. So interesting how those costs compare. After the first Transcontinental Railroad, there were many others. And by 1914, we had the Panama Canal, 1956, the Interstate Highway, jet airplanes in 1958, and so on. By modern times, the Transcontinental Railroad map was pretty complicated, lots of routes, kind of grouped in the 3 in the north and several in the center and lots of them in the south. But the one we're concentrating on, which we're going to talk about today, is the first one. And even though it's referred to as the Transcontinental Railroad, it's really, as you can see from the map, about half of the continent, starting in Council Bluffs, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska, across the river from each other. And the blue line is the Union Pacific, which built from Omaha to the west. And the red line is the Central Pacific, which started in Sacramento and built east to the meeting point at Promontory. And then shortly after that was completed to Sacramento, the railroad called the Western Pacific completed the journey from Sacramento to Oakland, just across from San Francisco. Well, why? Why was the Transcontinental Railroad needed? The travel time from Europe to the United States was somewhere between a month and a half to over 2 months, depending on the weather. From Europe to the Far East was a 4 to 6 month jaunt. So if you were going from United States, Midwest or East Coast to the Far East and back, you were up for a trip that could involve years. And the country was dreaming of being a player in the international stage and wanted to have better commerce to Europe and the Far East. And one of the big problems going the other way from the East or Midwest to California, you had really 2 choices. Either you could go overland on the Oregon or Mormon trails, and that was a 5 or 6 month trip. And that was only possible at certain times. You had to be sure you got off at the right time early in the spring, so you didn't get trapped on the western side with winter coming. Or you could go by sea, go down around Cape Horn. That could be 6 or 8 months. Or after 1855, there was a railroad built across the isthmus, and that would reduce it to, if you got the right connections and everything worked out, you could get to California in a month. But you couldn't depend on that. So, but the cost of these options were somewhat similar. It would cost about $1,000 for you to go to California by whatever route. Now, after the Transcontinental Railroad was built, you could get a ticket for just slightly over $100. And if they had what they called immigrant sleepers for half that price, and that was to encourage settlement. Well, here's one of the important names in the transcontinental story. Asa Whitney, a dry goods merchant. He was an early promoter because in the 1840s, he made a trip to China trying to find sources for his dry good business. And that trip took parts of 3 years. So he thought there's got to be a better way. And he published a memorial in 1849, and he kept updating it, making the case for a railroad. And why a railroad in 1842? Well, in 1827, the first railroad appeared in the United States, the Baltimore and Ohio. And by 1850, when he was actively promoting this scheme, there was 9,000 miles of track already built in the United States. So that seemed to be the transportation mode of the future at that time. Another name, and we'll get back to Asa Whitney later, Theodore Judah. He was the chief engineer of the Central Pacific Railroad. He kind of organized the railroad. He found the route through the Sierra, which was actually used. He rounded up the financing, signing up the so-called Big Four, and we'll meet those gentlemen later on. It was incorporated in 1861, but he was a little bit dissatisfied with the arrangements with the financing, and he was trying to arrange better financing and perhaps replace the so-called Big Four. So he took off on a trip to New York City by way of Panama, the railroad, but he died due to yellow fever. And that sort of illustrates the hazards of travel in those days. But we'll get back to him later also. Well, by the 1850s, there were lots and lots of schemes and proposed routes. Here's a map. It's kind of an interesting one of not a lot of detail, but showing the options that were being discussed, but nobody could agree on anything. You could get very little through Congress in those days. The parties were incredibly divided, could agree on almost nothing. And the reason was that, of course, we were leading up to the Civil War. The issue was new states and whether they would allow slavery or not. And that got to be an incredibly divisive issue. And this map, it's interesting because if you look down in the corner of the map, this was a map that was under the Department of War, and the Secretary of War was Jefferson Davis. Yes, that Jefferson Davis. This map was made in 1855 and updated in 1857. And the South, of course, really did not want a railroad in the North. They were proposing routes in the South. It didn't get resolved until actually the Civil War started. The Pacific Railroad Act was signed in 1862. Excuse me. Sorry about that. The Pacific Railroad Act, which was to encourage government financing of the railroad and to pick the route and make all the arrangements. They tried to pass it in 1860 and 1861, and it did not get signed until Abraham Lincoln signed it in 1862. And that was an amazing time. The Congress was, it was the 37th Congress, and they not only passed the Pacific Railroad Act, but they passed the Internal Revenue Act. It was the first real national income tax. That same month, in July 2, Lincoln signed the Morrell Land Grant College Act. And it was in that same month that Lincoln read his first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. Also in that Congress, they passed the Homestead Act. So here was this huge infrastructure aid to people making their lives better, homestead, land grant college. Do you see any parallels with the present day? Anyway, it was interesting that so much happened. But with the signing of the Pacific Railroad Act, then serious work started on the Transcontinental Railroad. And we've got to meet some other characters here. The president of the Union Pacific Railroad was, at first, Thomas Clark Durant. He later changed his role to vice president. He was a majority stockholder in the Union Pacific Railroad. He actually was a doctor. He graduated from the Albany Medical College. He was actually a professor of surgery, such as medical science was at the time. He chartered the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad. It was intended to build a railroad across Iowa from Davenport to Council Bluffs. And it connected with the Rock Island Railroad in the present Quad Cities. Rock Island, there was a government bridge, and they called it government bridge because there was a military reservation on an island. And there was a lawsuit about that bridge, and the steamboat people objected to a railroad bridge being built across their river. And Abraham Lincoln was hired by the M&M Railroad. And so that's when Durant met Abraham Lincoln. And they both visited Council Bluffs together. Lincoln ended up with some property in Council Bluffs. There was also another railroad being built at the time. It's called the Cedar Rapids and Missouri Railroad. It eventually became part of the Northwestern. And that one actually turned out to be the first connection with the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, we've already covered this one. I'm lost. Here we go. Okay. Now, here's another important character, and we'll talk about him later. Peter Day. He was the engineer in charge of the first surveys of the Union Pacific Railroad. He was the chief engineer between 1863 and 1864. He did some detailed, wonderful work, and particularly the first 100 miles going west from Omaha. And he estimated it could be built for $30,000 per mile. The government was offering at that time $32,000 a mile, plus land grants that were very generous. Well, the management of the Union Pacific wanted him to change his estimates to $50,000 per mile. And at that point, he just felt that it was not the honorable thing to do. This is one of the few honorable people you'll meet in this cast of characters. And he was told that they were going to issue a contract to a fellow by the name of Hoxie at $50,000 per mile. And they told him to change his estimates accordingly. Well, he resigned his position and he wrote a letter that closed with this statement. My views of the Pacific Road are perhaps peculiar. I look upon its managers as trustees of the bounty of Congress. You are doubtless informed how disappointed the amount to be paid is to the work, doubtless informed how disproportioned, the amount to be paid is to the work contracted for. I need not expatiate on the sincerity of my course when you reflect on the fact that I've resigned the best position in my profession this country has offered to any man. And one of the things he was talking about, this is a Peter Day map. If you look down here in the corner, he's signed it off. Here's, I hope you can see the pointer. This is Omaha and Council Bluffs, and the railroad goes kind of a little bit of a bend to the southwest, but mostly west, and then connecting up with the Platte River. That wasn't quite what the management wanted. And these were the so-called engineering people that Durant hired, a fellow by the name of Seymour. His designs were barely adequate at best, being kind. And this fellow, Hoxie, he was a contractor. And there were all kinds of shenanigans played. Here's a map. This one is signed by Seymour. And you can see here is Omaha. Hope you can see that all across from Council Bluffs. I've got a, the next slide. Here's an enlarged part of that map. And they've got this. This is the connection to the railroad that Durant owned. And they show a possible connection way down here at Bellevue. And this is adding quite a bit of mileage. And this is pretty much the original route that Peter Day had proposed. Well, actually, at one point, Abraham Lincoln had to make a decision where precisely the Pacific Railroad Act called for a presidential decision at some point to fix the point of starting the Pacific Railroad. And there was pretty much general agreement that it should be Council Bluffs, which is right across from Omaha. And so Lincoln issued the appropriate executive order. It was Council Bluffs. Durant had the first load of ties and rails delivered down here to Bellevue, which is quite a bit downstream. And why did he do that? Well, Durant had stock in this Mississippi and Missouri Railroad that he owned, but he knew that what was to be the Chicago Northwestern would actually be the connection. So he he had this material delivered down here, and he let the rumors fly that there must be connecting at Bellevue. So the stock in his railroad went way up. The stock in the Northwestern went down. He sold the stock in his railroad, bought Northwestern stock. In the meantime, in the space of about a week, everybody was saying, "What are you doing? The president's already fixed the end." Oh, I'm sorry, mistake. And he had all the stuff delivered back up to Omaha. But in just that maneuver, he made about $5 million. So anyway, here's the map of the Chicago Northwestern, and you can see the connection out here to Omaha. And this is Cedar Rapids and Missouri River. This fellow Seymour was quite an engineer. This is one of his wondrous works of engineering, the Dale Creek Bridge. When it was finished, the speed limit was slower than a walk. It was a very spindly, rickety, scary thing to cross. More on that later. But when they got into the serious building, and Durant was a politician, he realized he needed to do better. So he hired someone that actually turned out to be incredibly competent, Grenville Dodge. He then became the chief engineer of the Union Pacific Railroad. Now, he was connected by the 1867, late 66, 67. It was pretty clear that Ulysses Grant was going to replace Andrew Johnson as president of the United States. Well, Grenville Dodge had been in the Civil War with Grant, and he is credited with putting together one of the first military intelligence networks, and that supported General Grant, and one of the reasons we won the war. Grenville was also kind of a politically astute fellow, and he was actually a delegate to the Republican conventions, and particularly the one in 1868, which selected Grant. After his stint with the Union Pacific Railroad, his reputation was such that he actually helped build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and he was the chief engineer of the Texas Pacific Railroad. And you can see his home there in Council Bluffs, which is a historic site. This is a contemporary picture of it in Council Bluffs. Well, let's meet some of the other characters, the Union Pacific. This is Oliver Ames, and he got to be the Union Pacific president after Durant was demoted to vice president. And what was Oliver Ames' main qualification to be president of the Union Pacific? Well, essentially he was the brother of Oakes Ames, who was a member of Congress. Now, they invented this thing called credit mobilier, which was modeled after what the French created to build the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal Company got, well, all the contracts for building were run through the credit mobilier in the case of the canal, and the Suez Canal Company got invoices from Credit Mobilier, and they paid them, and the French government would, of course, audit those bills, and yes, they're legitimate and so on. Well, Durant and company thought that a scheme like that would be great for the Union Pacific Railroad, particularly if they also owned Credit Mobilier and were the officers of it. But that would be kind of on the QT. Government wouldn't know that necessarily. So the scheme was that the U.S. government paid the Union Pacific about $95 million for the construction of the UP Railroad. The Credit Mobilier costs of construction was about $50 million, about half, a little more than half. Credit Mobilier reported a profit of about $23 million. Well, they kind of left more than $20 million unaccounted for. Well, that ended up with the directors of Credit Mobilier, which were directors of the Union Pacific, although that didn't come out until 1872. when a story broke. And when it did, it was kind of neat. Some things don't change. Oaks, the New York Sun had broke the story of what this credit Mobilier did and how much money was missing. And so Congress created an investigative committee, and one of the people they called was Oaks Ames. And when he came to testify, he said that his sale of stock to other congressmen at the par value, which is just the value that was given to it when they created the stock, not what it was really worth. It was worth a lot more. It was selling a lot more, so that if you sold stock to somebody at par value, you were actually effectively giving them a lot of extra money. But he said that sale of stock to other congressmen, not illegal, no law preventing a congressman from owning stock or a construction company at all. And he said it definitely was not a bribe, because a bribe is a quid pro quo. Have you heard that phrase recently? It wasn't a bribe because it was about friendship, and one does not have to bribe one's friends. But the third and probably the most important point is he made it clear to the people in the investigative committee that he had detailed notes of every transaction with names, numbers, dates. And so the congressional committee quickly concluded, nothing to see here. Go on to something else. Okay. Let's go to the West Coast, the Central Pacific Railroad, the big four we talked about that were the people that organized the railroad and financed it. Leland Stanford, he was the CP president. He was a senator. He was governor of California at various times. And he's the guy that started Stanford University. Now, these fellows also knew how to make sure they made sufficient money on these deals, but they did it a little more skillfully. This is Leland Stanford's home that he built in San Francisco on Nob Hill. The Mark Hopkins mansion was just to the right of over here. It's under construction. All of these houses that were built by the Big Four burned in April of 1906 in the fire that consumed San Francisco after the earthquake. And number two of the Big Four, the vice president, Collis Huntington, he was the lobbyist. He's the paymaster for the CP as far as making sure that the right congressmen and government officials were properly greased. Now, he did very well. When he died in 1900, his estate was worth $1.6 billion. Now, they didn't have Credit Mobilier for the Central Pacific. They had the Contract and Finance Company, and they kept the books in Sacramento. Now, this congressional committee that was chaired by Congressman Wilson, he summoned Huntington to appear in 1872 after that New York Sun article. However, Collis Huntington was pretty shrewd. He could see the problem coming. And before he left, he made sure to clean up the office. So they burned 15 volumes of the Contract and Finance Company books before he left. And when he appeared before the committee, he said, "I'm sorry, we don't have the books anymore. We just kind of cleaned things out. Just don't have it. Sorry." So how much did they get away with? The estimates go from 100 million to over 200 million. but really nobody knows. They did a much better job of covering things up. This was the Huntington Mansion in San Francisco. Mark Hopkins, the treasurer, he had a really nice house. That's now the site of the Mark Hopkins Hotel. This is a little better picture of it. That house cost $3.5 million to build in 1878. That would be about $95 million in today's money. The fourth, Charles Crocker. He was the construction supervisor, and he went on to found the Southern Pacific Railroad. He was the guy that managed all of the contractors and so on. His mansion is where Grace Cathedral is now on Nob Hill. And he built another mansion next to this one for his son as a wedding gift. And when his son's mansion burned down in April 1906, the one item that was lost in the fire was 35 original Degas paintings. He was an art collector and he loved Degas. So that loss is probably would have been worth more now than most mansions put together, I'd imagine. Anyway, that's the big four. This is what the railroad looked like. This is on the Union Pacific side as they're making their way to Promontory. And you can tell the Union Pacific just by looking at the track. You notice the rough edges on the ties and how irregular they looked. They used what is called hewn ties. They are pretty rough cut, not nicely put through a sawmill and squared off or anything. Hewn ties. In general, their construction was pretty shoddy. Mr. Durant was more interested in his personal finances than in building a very robust railroad. This is another version of that Dale Creek Bridge. They had to strengthen it with, I don't know if you can see in the picture, you can see these cables trying to stabilize it. Later on, they replaced the, excuse me, they replaced the wooden trestle with steel. And you can see this is pretty spindly. They've got this little truss structure here to hold up these spans, so that they even had to replace that with a girder on this thing. And eventually the right of way was moved, and the route was moved to maybe a half mile away from this, and this site is abandoned. You can still see these stone supports if you visit the site. This is Green River, Wyoming. I'm just trying to make sure we're okay. Yes, Green River, Wyoming, sorry. And this is back in the day while it was being constructed, and you can see this temporary track here to get supplies and so on. This is what that spot looks like more recently with the modern railroad there. Now, looking at this piece of track, it's obvious just by looking that this is the west of Promontory on the Central Pacific. And you can notice a few things. The ties are cut off nicely, square here. The roadbed looks a little more finished and just better construction. You also notice these fellows here, the laborers, were mostly Chinese. You just could not get enough labor in the West. And so they brought lots of Chinese over to build the railroad, and they did a fantastic job. And their hygiene habits and culinary habits were so much better than the what was typical of the workers on the Union Pacific side, that they had much better health. They didn't have as much disease and other issues. You can see this is another, this was taken after the railroad was opened and was still being improved, but that trestle looks quite a bit more robust than the Dale Creek trestle. Here's a cut in the Central Pacific, material being hauled away. I think this is the construction supervisor here, and you can see the workers in the Chinese hats here. It did a fantastic job. The other thing they had to do on the western portion, Central Pacific, was snow sheds in the Sierras, and the size of those timbers was amazing. They had a friendly rivalry between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. They were racing to, the further they got, the more they would get paid for the right of way and the land grants and so on. And the Central Pacific started challenging the Union Pacific to track laying contests, and that went back and forth. So finally, toward the end, the Central Pacific decided that they would organize something very close to the final days of construction, so that the Union Pacific wouldn't have a chance to beat them. And they had quite a substantial bet between the two supervisors, and they ended up making just over 10 miles. It was 10 miles and 185 feet in 12 hours between 7 o'clock in the morning and 7 at night on the, I believe it was the 28th of April, 1869. And they even took time off for lunch. This was a place called Camp Victory. This is where they had lunch on that fateful day. And this was the day of the track laying contest. And this fellow here in the middle, Stowbridge, is the guy who was supervising. Okay, so the date and the place of meeting the two railroads was finally selected. Another executive order from President Lincoln at Promontory. That was to stop the parallel building. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific would actually had graded rights of way parallel to each other, going past each other. And it was in their interest to build as much as they could. They were paid by the mile and in land grants. So they agreed on the place of meeting, Promontory, and the date. It would be, I believe it was May 7th or 8th. And plans were made for the appropriate ceremony. And Leland Stanford set out from Sacramento in his private train with his private car. We see him here at Carlin, Nevada. And he has his baggage car full of appropriate adult beverages and fine food. Thomas Durant, even though he was vice president at the time, was proceeding west from Omaha, Council Bluffs. And he got as far as Piedmont, Wyoming, when his train was stopped by a pile of ties put there by some unpaid contractors. They wanted $200,000 that they had not been paid. Durant was irritated by this, or at least pretended to be. He got a hold of Dodge, who he wanted to telegraph for troops, using his association with President Grant. But the telegraph operator at Piedmont actually sent the message to the ringleaders of this construction gang. And so they weren't able to ask for help, only for the $200,000 it would take to pay the ransom. These contractors worked for a company called Davis and Associates. It turned out that later that Durant had an interest in that company. So was that one of Durant's last ploys before the golden spike to get more money? Probably. He telegraphed Durant. Durant telegraphed Stanford that it's just not possible to arrive before Monday. He telegraphed on Friday. That was the day they were supposed to be at Promontory. After he paid the bribe or the ransom or whatever it was to get past Piedmont, the next blockage was this temporary trestle across Devil's Gate in Weber Canyon. The Union Pacific people felt it was damaged in a flood and was not safe for the engine, the locomotive that was on Durant's train to get across. So they uncoupled the cars and hauled them across by ropes and winches and used an engine that was on the other side to get to Promontory. Here's a couple of cars from Durant's train with some of the brass from the Union Pacific. Here's other laborers getting close to Promontory. This is a replica of the engine that was actually used to haul Durant's train the final miles, and the one that was in the meeting of the two engines at the ceremony. Notice it's a, well, you can't really tell in the picture. It actually burns coal. This was built by the National Park Service, and they restaged that meeting of the locomotives every day in the summer at Promontory. Here's a picture of number 119 showing it does indeed burn coal. There was lots of coal along the Union Pacific. They also, the National Park Service built a replica of the Central Pacific engine, 60, Jupiter, and it was a wood burner. Here is a picture of it pulling Stanford's train. He was killing time. You see some figures up here on top of the mountain near Promontory. The layout of the area is the Golden Spike ceremony was here at Promontory Summit, not Promontory Point, Promontory Summit. Promontory Point is the place down here at the end of this point where the newer line that was built in just after 1900, the Lucian Cutoff, it eventually split Salt Lake into two pieces, and the water even is different colors. Okay. This is laying some of the last rails. This is on the CP side. You can see some of the Chinese laborers in the picture. There's still, if you look very carefully, there's a wooden rail gauge here to make sure the rails are the proper distance. And you can see 119 in the background there. This is the view on the Union Pacific side. And you can tell that by these rough hewn ties and the general less quality road bed contrasted with the Central Pacific side. Okay, I am going to read a few pages here from a book called The Empire Express. By David Bain. Came out in about 1999. It's a wonderful, very thoroughly researched, back to original sources, and avoids repeating a lot of the bad information that many other books about the Transcontinental Railroad keep repeating. This one is a very good account, and it's in some places almost poetic, and probably one of the most moving parts of it is just a few pages here I'd like to read describing the actual ceremony. In Washington, a large gathering crowded into the main office of the Western Union Company, where the manager had connected a magnetic ball to the main line and placed it in a conspicuous place. Over at the War Department, Generals Sherman and Rawlins waited by the telegrapher, hoping that President Grant would break away from his meetings and join them. In Chicago, Omaha, Philadelphia, Scranton, Buffalo, Boston, New Orleans, and many, many other places, the telegraph was fixed to the central fire alarm bells and to gongs in the Western Union offices. And to many, it seemed like an indrawn breath had been taken, anticipating the next event. For all intents and purposes, the entire nation was now connected in one great electrical circuit. The Western Union manager in Washington tapped out that he was ready. Telegraphers in New York, Boston, and New Orleans instantly answered that they were ready. It was about 2:27 p.m. in the east, 12:27 p.m. at Promontory, and there was a sudden clamor on the lines as many offices sent inquiries to the Omaha office at the head of the circuit. To everybody, Omaha replied, keep quiet. When the last spike is driven at Promontory, we will say, done. Don't break the circuit, but watch for the signals of the blows of the hammer. There was some trouble in the Chicago office. Somewhere west of Buffalo, a circuit closed. Washington readjusted and again was ready. Watson N. Schilling, you can see him here in this picture, sitting at a little table with a telegraph key out under the Utah sun, tapped out, almost ready, hats off, prayer is being offered. There were 12 or 13 minutes of silence while the Reverend Dr. Todd stood at the joining place and asked the favor of heaven upon the enterprise. At 2:40 p.m. in Washington, the message bell rang again. We have got done praying, Watson tapped again. The spike is about to be presented. Chicago replied, we understand, all are ready in the east. The presenters of the ceremonial spike stepped forward. W.H. Harkness of the Sacramento Press, handing Governor Stanford the inscribed golden spike. Sedgwick exposed a photograph of the ceremony from about 30 yards away in the sagebrush, catching the crowd in a large knot between the two engines. Two of the telegraph men had climbed the ladder, leaning against the pole to get a better view from above, and one had now perched on the crosspiece, holding onto the flagpole. The breeze was out of the west, and the flag was rampant. Now Stanford was responding on behalf of the Central Pacific, accepting the gifts and expressing in spectacularly dull sentiments. The governor went on, and if anyone there began to measure the distance between the iron rails and the nearest tent purveying Red Jacket by the shot, their attention would have finally snapped back to the central scene as Stanford rose to perhaps his greatest oratorical moment. In conclusion, he announced, raising the spirits of the assembly, I will add that we hope to do ultimately what is now impossible on long lines. That is, transport coarse, heavy, and cheap products for all distance at living rates of trade. It was a hard act for Chief Engineer Dodge to follow. He may have been an active backroom kind of a politician in Des Moines, Council Bluffs, in Washington, but he was a man of action, not of words. And when he responded for the Union Pacific, he kept it short. In Washington, the clerk in the Attorney General's office, Walt Whitman, would avidly devour all press accounts of the ceremony, later in the year beginning his magisterial poem, Passage to India. Samuel Reed and James Stowbridge lowered the laurel tie, and the squads of Chinese and Irish track layers put down the last two rails, their foreman quickly fixing them in place. Stanford and Durant dropped the precious spikes into their slots, and the laborers, having gotten the two last common iron spikes started in the wood, the governor stood at the south rail, the doctor at the north, half the world at their backs, as Bret Hart would write. Telegrapher Watson Schilling tapped out a message, all ready now. The spike will soon be driven. The signal will be 3 dots for the commencement of the blows. All that was required was that each of them make a light tap with their hammers. In many subsequent accounts, it was imaginatively and derisively alleged that both missed their swings. There's no contemporary evidence of that. The doctor raised his hammer, the governor raised his silver maul. They looked at the telegrapher, Schilling, who tapped out 3 dots and said simply, okay. And the work was done. As simultaneously as distance and the speed of electricity permitted, a 15-inch gun overlooking Fort Point on the Pacific, connected by underground wire to San Francisco City Hall, thundered with striking of all the fire bells in the city. From the train yards in Sacramento, all the locomotive whistles shrilled with cannons boomed and bells rang in Independence Hall. In Omaha, every Union Pacific engine's steam whistle opened up, joined by 100 cannons. Church bells and the fire alarms rang all over Iowa City, alerting Peter Day at Locust Hill near the Soldiers' Home in Washington. The clamor from the Capitol would have reached Asa Whitney. In Greenfield, Massachusetts, the bells of St. John's Church were heard by Anna Judah, who had refused herself all visitors and stayed home alone to read and reflect on that day, May 10th, her wedding anniversary. It seemed as though the spirit of my brave husband descended upon me, she recalled, and together we were unseen, unheard of man, as the assembly at Promontory let forth with cheer after cheer. And Leland Stanford heartily shook the hand of Thomas Clark Durant, and Durant exclaimed, "There is henceforth but one Pacific Railroad of the United States." Cheers followed for the engineers, the contractors, the laborers who had done the work. But of course, the names of Day, Judah, and Whitney went unsaid. The 2 locomotives drew together until their pilots were all but touching, and 2 engineers mounted the pilots to touch celebratory champagne bottles, while other men climbed all over the locomotives to stand or lean against the warm iron flanks triumphantly. Grenville Dodge and Samuel Montague stood below them at the edge of the track and shook hands. Andrew Russell exposed the most famous photograph of the day. And that's a good place, I think, to stop.